The repetition of an affirmation, mantra, or symbol can be very powerful and can eventually lead to the bypassing of the rational apparatus of the mind. We are capable of generational transformation by using the full spectrum of the power of our thoughts.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to use metaphysics to change your life and change the world, then do we have the Magic of Believing Action Plan show for you. Today I'll be talking with Mitch Horowitz, a leader in the New Thought movement, a 2020 writer-in-residence at the New York Public Library, PEN Award-winning historian, the author of The Miracle Club and the Napoleon Hill Success Course series, including The Secrets of a Self-Mastery, and the author of a powerful new treatise on mind as creator, The Magic of Believing Action Plan. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about how we create a new future for ourselves, our country, and the world through the power of our mind. That, plus we'll talk about doodling dollar signs, J.B. Duke, wave superpositions and Schrodinger's cat, TNT and Phyllis Diller, and what in the world being mildly hopeful gotcha, has to do with anything. So welcome back to the show, Mitch. Are you ready to shine?
Yes, sir. Glad to be here, as always. Thank you.
So glad to be here. And even though we discussed the one woo, I have to give it still a woohoo.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the listeners understand that, we were talking before the show about being mildly hopeful, and I jokingly suggested to Michael this is a one-woo show because we're in the middle of so many crises, but I'm glad you brought the two woos. I salute that.
Thank you. And you're in New York City, so you are in the thick of things on multiple levels. Before we dive right into things, though, you got your start in writing long before you were discussing or maybe even reading about metaphysics as a police reporter.
That's right.
What can you tell us about that? And are there any tie-ins to today?
Well, being a police reporter was frankly a very unhappy time in my life, or I would have stuck with it. But I did do it for some time at a regional newspaper in northeastern Pennsylvania. And it was amazing training. I can certainly say that. One of the things that I write about in Magic of Believing Action Plan, which is an exploration of Claude Bristol's classic book, Magic of Believing. Claude also was a police reporter, a sterling writer. And when you have to write copy under oppositional conditions, when you're surrounded by people who may not necessarily like you or may not necessarily relate well to you, whether they be cops or perpetrators or what have you, you really learn fast how to hone your craft, how to write a beautiful, pristine, neat paragraph, sentence, how to get to the who, what, when, where, why, and how very, very quickly. And it's wonderful training. I often say to people, I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I feel fortunate for having gone through it.
What kind of a critical eye does it give you, if any, for looking at the world today?
Well, there are big trust issues. The cops often think that the reporters have it in for them. The reporters might not relate very well to the cops. Maybe in some cases they come from different backgrounds. Even if they didn't come from different backgrounds, people suspect you're from a different background and that you don't have the capacity to understand them or understand their problems. Definitely, there are major trust issues. One person involved in a dispute might say something, and the thing that person is saying might be fair, might be reasonable, but the other people who are hearing it are thinking, you're only saying that as a cover for this. You're criticizing the police because you're anti-cop. To which my response might be, I'm not anti-cop. I'm not anti-cop at all. But I'm looking at a policy or I'm looking at an individual and I'm opposed to it for these reasons. But sometimes people are unable to hear what you're saying because they think you're saying something else. We see this on the right, we see this on the left, like I'll criticize Trump or something like that. And somebody, who supports Trump will read into what I'm saying and think, well, you're lined up against me in all these different ways, to which my response is, I'm not lined up against you. You and I might have things that we both firmly agree on. We might have cultural styles that are very similar. We might both like, mixed martial arts. We might both like guns. We might both like something else. There may be areas where we can really bond, but because I'm against your guy, you suspect that there's all these other things that I'm about. So we have to watch very carefully because sometimes we get into these phantom arguments And they're really very heavily based on questions of trust.
Thank you. And I can't believe I'm going to make this tie-in today because I want to take us into metaphysics and changing the world. But does metaphysics and trust issues go hand in hand?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. They must, because metaphysics is, from my perspective, is a constant in our lives. I mean, when I say spirituality, I mean the extra-physical, or call it the metaphysical. I believe absolutely, and I think we have proof, if one wants to get down to questions of proof, that we do lead an extra-physical existence, that our lives are more than motor skills and cognition. There's no question in that regard. If that weren't the case, there would be no neuroplasticity. If that weren't the case, there would be no legitimate psychical research, which there is. If that weren't the case, then the conundrums of quantum physics wouldn't occupy us with such intensity, and so on and so forth. If I'm correct that we lead a metaphysical existence as well as our above-ground day-to-day lives, then questions of whether you trust me, whether I trust you, are bound to color our encounters in ways that go beyond the ordinary cues of existence, but they must color our encounters in ways that suggest a communication and maybe even a co-creation that colors our existence together in a very serious way.
So we're going to get to Claude Bristol in a minute, but before we do that, since you talked about trust issues on an individual basis, when we talk about the metaphysics, there seems to be a direct correlation between how much we trust mind as creator, at least on the positive, and how much we're able to create.
That is a really wonderful point, and I ask myself that question sometimes at various times of the day, sometimes multiple times. If I really trust in the mind as creator thesis, if I really believe that thoughts are causative, why am I so scared? Why do I find it so difficult to enter into the feeling state of having received, which is supposed to be the royal road to mental causation? And I ask myself a lot of questions about that. I do trust and I do believe that our thoughts are causative. I feel that with an absolute certainty from both my experience, from the testimony of other seekers, as well as from some of the developments that I was referencing earlier that we in this generation have the benefit of experiencing, that make it very plain that our minds evince an extra-physical force. But sometimes I am emotionally too distraught to trust that force. You know, I had an experience yesterday where somebody was very rude to me. And I mentioned to someone close to me that so-and-so had been very rude to me. And she said, oh, you know, you don't have time for that. Don't worry about it. You need to focus on more positive things. And I said, you know, I know you're correct. I know you're correct, of course. But emotions are lodged in us with a certain memory.
Yes.
And when someone does something that triggers that memory, the emotions are off and running. And emotions are overpowering. We make the mistake sometimes of conflating our thoughts with our emotions, but they're very different. One of the things I write is that pitting thought against emotion is like pitting steam power against nuclear power. The latter is going to win out every time. Yeah. We have to respect that. You know, we have to respect that. You can't talk yourself out of grief. You can't talk yourself out of fear. These things sometimes are triggered in us, not always appropriately, but they're triggered in us because we have some deep-seated episode that made an emotional impression on us. I believe emotions form memories in people. I think this is one of the reasons why, for example, you might grow up in a household with somebody and remember an incident as being very traumatic, and this other person, maybe a sibling, seems not to remember it at all. And it can seem very frustrating. It can even seem gaslighting in a certain way. But it's possible that what's going on is that incident made a profound emotional impression on you. It did not make a profound emotional impression on the other person for whatever reason. And I believe very strongly that emotions form memories within our long-term psyche. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I can't expound on the mechanics of any of that, but it's certainly been an observation about human nature. So that's true, of course, of positive and negative emotions. And if you're feeling emotional and you're getting tripped up and somebody comes to you and says, hey, don't focus on that, you know, that's not productive. Well, of course, intellectually, you know they're right, but emotionally, your emotions are off and running like a wild horse with a sense of momentum all of their own, very often rooted in memory. So I have to have sympathy for myself and for other people that when they're told you need to get into this feeling state that allows your psyche to perform in this way that seems to shape and influence events, that's not always possible. That's not always possible because we are emotionally distraught, and that has to be respected.
And to take it beyond that and kind of blow out this concept, first off, what you're talking about is from a neuroscience point of view is a myelinated superhighway. The thoughts that we think become wired together. What wires together? How does it go? What fires together, wires together, and it becomes this deep groove.
We form neural pathways. Absolutely correct. We form neural pathways. Yes. It's physical. It's real.
I think we even form, because I'm talking today as mind, as collective, having one mind, we form these myelinated superhighways of consciousness among humanity as well. So we have triggers when we look in the news today, when we see things on the street today, we have triggers, I believe, that are multi-generational, that go back even before us, which can tripwire an emotional response that we're going, where did this come from? And so we can say, I'm staying positive, and then read something, or hear a siren, or a gunshot, or a flashbang goes off, and all of a sudden, our emotions are completely overtaken and off to the races.
I think you're raising an incredibly important point, and let's unpack that for a second.
Sure.
The ancient Greeks believed in the existence of a great, that sounded like thunder.
Yes, that was both cool and ominous.
Yeah, well, let's dig it. Let's go with it. The ancient Greeks believed in the concept of an overmind or an oversoul or infinite mind, a term we might use today. They called it nous they spelled it differently, but alliteratively we would spell it with an N. Mm-hmm. And this is a central concept within Hermeticism, which is a late ancient Greek Egyptian philosophy.
As above, so below.
As above, so below, precisely. And the ancients believed, the ancient Greek Egyptians who wrote the Hermetic works believed very literally in this concept of nous, or an overmind. It's very much like what you're just saying. Now, if they are correct, and I surmise that they were, for all the reasons that we've been discussing up to this point in the show, then it would stand to reason that as above, so below. You just said it. In the same sense that our minds, our brains are hardwired, so to speak. Yeah. Why couldn't this nous, this overmind, this oversoul, this infinite mind, this great overarching form of non-localized intellect also be hardwired? You know, I'm speaking metaphorically, but This could be an actual, literal, palpable, physical thing. We may not understand the mechanics of it, but we're very, very aware, we're very, very cognizant that consciousness evinces some extra physical force, and people who ran the psychical research lab at Princeton did studies around the time of 9/11 with what are called random number generators, which they placed at spots around the globe, and they found these random number generators, which spit out infinitely random patterns of numbers, were showing patterns. At the time of 9/11, immediately before, during, and after. Patterns appeared where there shouldn't have been any, which suggested to the researchers that there might be some kind of global consciousness effect, not unlike what you're describing right now. So it's not as if all this is just belief-based or is just speculative. I mean, we have concrete data that at least allows us to peek through the keyhole and suggest that something is there. So I think what you're describing is very real.
Thank you. In fact, we had on Howard Martin a week and a half ago with Heart Math, talking about this very concept and the Global Coherence Project, and measuring what's going on with devices all around the planet and tracking. And I'm interested to see, he is too. They haven't shared the science yet of what's coming out, but he believes, as you do, as I do, that there is certainly something here. And the head researcher who did these studies at 9/11 is a dear friend who's working with Heart Math.
That's fascinating.
If there is an overmind here, if there is a collective mind, and mind is creator, are we creating temporarily, because I'm very positive about this, a collective nightmare with our minds?
I'd have to at least say it's extremely possible. How could I dissent from that? Given everything we've been discussing and the HeartMath Project and the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab, experiences of individual seekers, just a thoughtful look at the events in our world today, as well as our understanding of human nature. How could I dissent from that? Of course we are. There's no question in my mind.
And so the question becomes, and that brings us to Claude M. Bristol, how can we create then a collective positive dream? So maybe tell us at this point, who was Claude M. Bristol? And then what happened to him in World War I? Because this dude went through World War I, Spanish flu, the Depression. Talk about being in the thick of, in many ways, right where we are today.
Yes. Claude M. Bristol was a fascinating man who wrote only 2 books in his life. The first was called TNT, It Rocks the Earth, which was sort of a basic treatise on New Thought. And the second, which is the book for which he's fairly widely known, is The Magic of Believing, which is a favorite book of mine, a favorite book of many people who are into the question of mental causation. Claude was a journalist and businessman who grew up in the American West. He was born in the late 19th century, and he was drafted into the First World War in 1918, which was the first year of America's involvement in that conflict and the last year of that war. He was transferred to France, and he was charged with hauling ammunition around very dangerous battlefield conditions. And there was some snafu with his army paperwork, and for several weeks, Claude was in France without any pay. So although he had a place to sleep on the ground, and although he had meals, obviously provided by the military, he couldn't purchase a thing, not a cigarette, not a stick of gum, not a magazine, not a piece of writing paper, nothing whatsoever. He was completely destitute. And every time he saw someone light up a cigarette or throw a gum wrapper on the floor or something like that, he would just be filled with envy. And he swore to himself during that period of time that he would never be in a situation like that again, where he was absolutely bereft of money. He would live in a prosperous way the rest of his life. And eventually his paperwork got straightened out. He was transferred from the battlefield to a commission to work on the newspaper Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, returned back home to the United States, where he, continued his work as a police reporter, expanded into various business fields and such. But Claude kept his promise to himself. He did become very prosperous over the course of his career, and he came to believe very strongly that what you hold at the very gravitational center of thought will outpicture in your world. And you mentioned in your intro, what does doodling dollar signs have to do with today's show? Well, one of the things that Claude would do is that he would constantly and perpetually doodle these little dollar signs on pieces of paper wherever he was, whatever he was doing, whether it was in a meeting, whether he was on the telephone, whatever it may be. It was a constant act. And again, as so many of the Inspire Nation listeners know and can attest to, we as a human community have the bad habit of overlooking very simple things. We think because something is simple, it can't possibly be meaningful or workable. But Claude felt that this little act, just such a small act of constantly and perpetually doodling dollar signs, kept that aim of prosperity at the forefront of his mind, and his life did begin to unfold in that direction. He recounted some of these experiences, first in that earlier book, TNT, published in 1932. That was a pamphlet. Actually, I have a first edition of it behind me, but I don't want to step out of the shot.
Gotcha.
And then his second book was called, and this is the book which really became famous, was called The Magic of Believing, which he published in 1948. And The Magic of Believing is just one of the most engaging, beautiful, practical, but also expansive books on mind metaphysics that I've ever read. So my action plan seeks to add contemporary findings and practices to Claude's ideas. And it was very meaningful to me because that book has proven a huge influence in my life.
I wanted to talk with you about having a passionate, absolute, definite, unshakable aim. However, with today's situation, is there a way to hold two things simultaneously? An absolute, definite, chief, passionate, unshakable aim for ourselves as individuals and for the collective?
That's a really wonderful question, Michael. let's unpack that for a second. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. There's different points of view about this. Napoleon Hill, who's been a huge inspiration on me, would say, nope, you got to have that one absolute definite aim. There's no compromising. And you might say back to Napoleon Hill, but I also care about the community around me.
Yeah.
Other people in mind metaphysics, maybe Wallace D. Wattles would say, and Wallace D. Wattles, who wrote Science of Getting Rich, was a man of profound social concerns. I mean, he was a person possessed of very, very deep and serious social concerns, died much too young from tuberculosis. Wallace made the case that you can best affect the collective whole by tilling your own garden, and that if each one of us tills his or her own garden, millions of gardens add up to the collective whole. Now, that's certainly a reasonable perspective, but I suspect it doesn't satisfy your hunger, because you're saying, well, I like that too, but I'm looking out my window and I'm out on the street and I see things that need addressing right now. I would say the following. One of the lessons I've learned on the spiritual path is that a mark of maturity, perhaps the mark of maturity, is the capacity to live with paradox, is the capacity to hold two truths at once. And so if one has that capacity, and I think it's really necessary, of course you can hold your definite chief aim, and of course you can also, with deep urgency, hold to the aim of seeing a more constructive world today, immediately, at 4 p.m., right around us. We must live with paradox. We cannot hem ourselves into this kind of binary mindset, this either-or mindset. We inherit this either-or thinking because it seems to make life simple. But think about it. Many of the Inspire Nation listeners perhaps have rejected the binary mindset that they found in the religion of their youths, like a sin and salvation model, for example, or something else. And they said, no, I've got to go and I've got to explore spiritual questions on my own terms. So bravo. But in so doing, let's not recreate that same binary mindset by saying, no, you can only have one definite chief aim, and if the building next door is burning, literally or metaphorically, just stick with that aim. Of course, we as mature beings must live with paradox. So I think it's not only possible, it's necessary.
Thank you. And I think there was a key word that you used, and I'm so glad you mentioned paradox, because everything is a paradox. When I share any teaching right now, I'm saying, and let's talk about the paradox of this. You said vision a minute ago, and that's so important, because if we take Napoleon Hill, if we take Wallace Wattles, and we talk about having that one specific vision, even if we work, and I often say that selfishness is the ultimate selflessness. But in this case, we're talking about, because when you raise yourself up, the rising tide lifts all ships. However, where do we want to go? So we need to have room to be able to hold, I believe, as well as you're tilling your own garden, to realize how that garden fits into the whole and how you want that entire forest to evolve.
Yes. This is challenging for me because my outlook, it's not selfish, but it's very self-oriented, and I have to be frank about that. Obviously, I have things I want to see occur in the world. Obviously, I feel a sense of reciprocity, a sense of ethical obligation toward other people. If you believe in this concept of nous or an overmind, as above, so below, then you have to concede that what you do to another, you're doing to self. So I take that very seriously. However, I have, for much of the past several years, been very self-focused. I have to be frank about that. I can't mislead the Inspire Nation viewers and listeners. But I'm also asking myself, within the framework of absolute sincerity, within the framework of absolute integrity, how do I expand that to meet the needs that I'm seeing around me? So the needs I'm seeing around me are a healthcare crisis, are a crisis in people being treated equally in the eyes of the law, are a crisis in civility, an absolute breakdown on social media and elsewhere of any capacity to have an exchange without it descending into the most grotesque bickering. These are areas, there are others I could name, but these are macro areas, big areas. Equality in the eyes of the law, healthcare crisis, civility. These are three that tug deeply at me. I need to be more focused on that over the remainder of this year. And I just have to hold myself to that. I've been self-focused. I have to be more focused on that.
And that is a challenge that I've been having as far as how to thread the needle with this show, is how to help people on an individual basis, and how we look at the collective mind, the overmind during this time, because truly mind is creator, and I cannot see us as being anything but an individual rose on a giant bush, and we are all in this together.
That's well put. That's well put. And of course, economically, if we let's say you run into somebody who's a strict materialist. By materialist, this person believes that matter just creates itself. There's no extra physicality. Well, economically, can't you make the same argument? Do you want to be in a situation economically where the country is absolutely stratified, absolutely desperate, and someone's, off on his yacht while you've got millions of desperate people? It's unsustainable. I think every reasonable person knows that at this point. We may have different ideas about how you get out of that, but it's absolutely unsustainable.
Thank you. Let's go from there, and let's talk kumbaya for a minute. Let's talk about beginner's mind, because it's interesting. You picked up the cup right now as I was going to talk about having an empty cup and the importance of that.
Who says there's not an occult dimension to life? That's interesting. That's interesting.
What can you tell me about the beginner's mind, and just how important is it?
Well, it's a concept from Zen Buddhism, this notion that if you can approach a topic without prejudice, you can be creative in all kinds of just amazing, amazing ways. And sometimes I encourage people to pick up an old New Thought text, whether it's Magic of Believing or Science of Getting Rich or a book by Neville Goddard or something else, and just imagine what it would be like if you were picking up this book for the very, very first time, and what it would be like if you were experiencing Think and Grow Rich for the very first time, as though it were 1937 and you were just picking this thing up at your local bookstore or your department store where they sell books. Did you know department stores used to sell books? They used to have a book section. Different epoch in human history, but yeah. So let's say you pick up Think and Grow Rich.
I'm going back to my Ann and Hope at the first mall in New England, at the Liberty Tree Mall, and they had a book section in there, Mitch.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Yeah, there used to be all kinds of enormous bookstores that you could find in malls and other places. But in any case, let's say you go back to Think and Grow Rich, and your intent is to approach it with beginner's mind. You're very powerful, because you're going to do every one of those exercises for dear life. You're not going to have this semi-sophisticated mindset that says, oh, I've done that already. I get that already. I've been there already. I understand that already. There's a lot of things we don't do because we think we get it, we understand it. And we also see beginner's mind as a potentially very powerful tool when somebody is approaching a field maybe that they've never entered before. A lot of people tell me that the great innovators in their field are either people who started very early or very late, because they're not schooled in what's quote unquote possible. Yeah. And when you're not schooled in what's possible, and you have the actual abilities to approach a field in a constructive way, you can vault beyond prejudices that would hold other people back. So it can be quite remarkable. Early comers and late comers tend to be the innovators. Look at computers. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were early comers. And their goal, their wish, their desire was to create a computer that was as easy to use as a toaster. You just put the bread in and you press the lever down. And their goal was to create a computer that didn't even have an on-off switch, because it's just working all the time. You pull the thing out of the box and it's working. So they were early comers. A late comer might be the handgun manufacturer Gaston Glock. Mm-hmm. Glock, and I read about this in the action plan, he had until middle age been a manufacturer of curtain rods and field knives. When the Austrian military put out a call for a new kind of lightweight handgun, he started thinking in terms of using very hard plastics, and he was undeterred by what people perceived as impossible, what people perceived as something that couldn't be done. he had training as an engineer, so he knew how to make things. That's very important. You can't just, go from whatever, running an ice cream shop to saying, I think I'll be a munitions manufacturer. I mean, he had training, but he was able to apply that training in a completely fresh way because he approached the field with very little foreknowledge in middle age. And so he created an item that was considered to be very innovative. Those are just two examples I use, but there are many, many examples that you could use of beginner's mind.
Thank you. Let's go from beginner's mind to, in a sense, going back to the collective. We'll call it collective assistance to mind. You say, when your mind is profoundly and deeply focused on something, you may be constantly sending out a kind of communication, a kind of signal to other people who may be able to help you, who may be able to meet you halfway.
Yes, it's really fascinating. I'm very interested in psychical research, ESP research, and I write about this in some detail in the action plan. I won't unload all of the facts and figures, but there's absolutely no question in my mind that psychical research has used statistical models to measure and to document extraphysical transfers of information in laboratory settings. It's absolutely valid, or the statistical models upon which we rely are broken in some way that we don't know. It's absolutely valid science. Absolutely.
The science so valid that it is actually many times statistically more valid than the pharmaceuticals we are actually taking.
That is true. That is true. I mean, you could get a pharmaceutical process through the FDA with a study that might be very slight and slender compared to psychical research, which has been juried, vetted, subject to calumny, subject to all kinds of scrutiny for decades. And yet the basic research has stood up. The basic research has stood up. Reporters don't know this. And the reason they don't know this, which I'll be writing about in a future article, is that the dogmatic skeptics have been so successful at shutting down psychical research on college campuses that and are so powerful in terms of influencing what appears on Wikipedia and so forth, that if you do a search for any of the stuff I'm talking about, the first 5 results that you get will persuade you that this research has not stood up. And that's a tragedy, because that limits our capacity for intellectual inquiry in the United States. I think that will change over time. Just like the whole UFO argument has changed over time. No serious person would possibly deny today that there's not a very legitimate question around UFOs. No one would deny that. So psychical research will find its way, although it's been set back. Anyway, to your question, we have evidence that the mind communicates in extraphysical ways, call it telepathy. So there's no question that when we're focused on something and there's an emotional passion, there's a unification of thought and emotion, which you might call the psyche. When the psyche is really charged with that idea, it's entirely possible that we may be communicating in some extraphysical way that we don't know. It may not be constant. It may get interrupted all the time. There may be it may be occurring in an uneven or indeterminate way where we're not always able to direct it or spike it as wished, but it is occurring. It is occurring. And someone once suggested to me, could it be that all this positive thinking that we talk about really is the effect of telepathy as felt in day-to-day life? Maybe you need something. One of your listeners needs something. Maybe you are seeking out people who can lend a hand, assist you, meet you halfway. And then something happens that seems completely anomalous, and we're awestruck by it. It has very deep emotional relevance to us. And it's not easy to measure. I'm always telling people who are into statistics. Statistics are wonderful for measuring long-range trends in society. They're not as useful for measuring the depth of responses and reactions that people feel to things, which are much harder to grasp because there are so many factors feeding into it. So if you find help at the most unexpected time in the most unexpected way, you feel shocked into believing that there's some meaning behind that. And I don't think that's wrong. Materialist skeptics will say that, well, that's how our brains work. Our brains impose patterns on things. But what they don't realize is that their thought systems are subject to the same phenomenon. They impose patterns on things, and their pattern is what? Is to reject patterns. Their pattern is to say, oh no, there can't possibly be any meaning in that. Go back to sleep. Go back to whatever you're doing before. They think they're immune from their own diagnosis. So I accept, and they are correct, that sometimes we rush to impose patterns on things. But does that mean there aren't significant events? Does that mean there aren't things occurring that go beyond that paradigm? Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. And it is possible that what we colloquially call positive thinking may be some sort of effect of telepathy or thought transmission, the delivery system of which we don't know yet, but we are able to measure the effects.
Beautiful. And this gets me thinking. I'm going to see if I can sew this all together to affecting the effects. So I do a funny thing each morning. Well, I love it. I wouldn't call it funny. I sit down with birdseed admittedly in my hands, and I do a meditation, and I'll have chipmunks, golden mantle squirrels, and full-on giant gray-red squirrels sitting in my lap for meditation. I've done this since springtime or since the snow melted here. I didn't even know I could do it. And it's really cool. But one of the interesting things is if a chipmunk, squirrel, or whatever spooks anywhere, they all spook appearing to be simultaneous, like watching a flock of birds changing direction without possibly having a cue or a school of fish. They will all suddenly bolt and then come back, bolt and move back. And it gets me thinking of the riots that we saw were very, very violent in the early days. And I watched 2 nights ago the protests outside the White House.
Yes.
Where some people started to throw rocks and water bottles, and somebody yelled, "This is a peace protest. We are above this."
Yes.
And they all stopped.
Yes. Yes. That's fascinating. The psychical researcher Rupert Sheldrake has studied this effect, particularly in animals. And the very term that Sheldrake used escapes me at the moment, but I am writing about it. It will appear in a future article. But he talked about the existence of these, I'm going to just use my own term, psychobio fields, and that these psychobiological fields are perhaps the basis of what might be a group instinct. So animals who are in a forest flee from a forest fire that might actually be physically many, many miles away, not detectable by sound, heat, smoke, or any of the typical signifiers, and yet they get out of there, and their fellow species get out of there, and other species get out of there. Why would that be? And so Sheldrake theorizes very powerfully, and based on clinical study, the existence of these psychobiological fields. I'm not using the term that he uses, which escapes me at the moment, but it's a lot like what you're saying. And if it occurs, if this is a law, a natural law, then it has to be consistent. So it could just as easily be extrapolated to us as individuals.
And I look at that. We had on recently two-time Nobel Prize nominee, Irvin Laszlo. He's won some other World Peace Prizes. And his next book is on the Akashic field, and a formed field. And this kind of gets us down that quantum road. Yes. But what it suggests is sort of like an animal spooks and is pumping something into the field. We can all choose during this time, if we want to go from a collective nightmare to a collective dream, to pump something else into the field, and that will inform and affect the effect of everyone and everything.
I think that has to be true. My friends in the Transcendental Meditation movement and the David Lynch Foundation have studied for many years what they call the Maharishi effect, and that is that if you have some sizable group of people meditating within a given locale over a given period of time, you see a decrease in the stats of social crisis, violent crime, domestic abuse.
I have a statistic on that. 23%, the Maharishi and TM, when they did their meditations and their experiments, statistically showed crime in the DC area, isn't that relevant here?
That's right.
Went
Absolutely.
down by 23% and stuck, because I was researching this recently myself.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I have to say, I know some of the folks within the David Lynch Foundation, and I think their science is really impeccable. I think that they're very responsible. I think that people at the Maharishi University are really, truly, genuinely dedicated to bringing science to the back of the study of meditation. And that was something I have to say to the Maharishi's credit. When he came to the United States for the first time in 1959, he realized very early on that in the West, you really needed to marry science to anything that you might talk about in terms of spiritual progress or extra-physical progress. And the Maharishi himself was trained as a physicist before he became a monk. And lots of people are attempting to bring the scientific method to studies of spirituality. He did it really early on, and he aligned his efforts very early on with very rock-solid people in science. And I think the science that has emerged from the David Lynch Foundation is very solid. A good friend of mine is a man named Norm Rosenthal, who's a professor of clinical psychology at Georgetown University. And Norm has participated in some of these studies, and he's a scientist of just the absolute highest integrity. They're doing good work there.
Thank you. So then bring us back, as I sidetracked it, bring us back to the Maharishi effect and what that means for us today.
Well, it seems to me that they have established, certainly, I mean, they're using TM, okay? Not everybody practices TM.
Transcendental meditation for this one.
Transcendental meditation. They have established that some sort of a collective psychical state, some sort of a collective emotional mental state, absolutely evinces a measurable effect on surrounding events. And it's clearly a positive effect as defined by the statistics of crisis. Those statistics drop under the study of the Maharishi effect. If that doesn't have a general rule that we can all extrapolate from, I don't know what does. You know, it's a powerful general rule, it seems to me.
It means we get to watch our thoughts, watch our state. We can go down that myelinated superhighway, but do what we can for the individual and the collective, realizing that our mind is a creator as part of the greater mind to bring it back for the benefit of all.
Without question, without question. And I think that if we set the intention, for example, I mean, here's a very simple intention that people can set for themselves, that they believe in the dignity of the individual. They reject the marginalization of groups, and they reject debasing or humiliating other individuals. I mean, isn't that something we can all commit to? Reject the humiliation or the debasing of other individuals, whoever they may be. That doesn't just mean the people you like. That means everybody. Reject the marginalization of different groups and dedicate to a civil, constructive behavior, both online and in person. I don't think that presents people with a burden that is too great. And if you commit to that and if you fail, don't worry about it. Just pick yourself up and do it again. There's not some punishment for failing. You know, I'll lose my temper sometimes, and I won't say to myself, well, see, it's no use. No, of course I'm going to lose my temper. But okay, you know, I failed. Now I'm going to try again for the next hour. There's no punishment. It's just something to commit to and see what happens.
Thank you, thank you. Since we're playing with science today, I'm having real fun geeking out on this. Let's talk about quantum science for a minute and what it means to live in a serial universe and how we can affect, the universe we choose to play out.
Well, you're hitting upon a topic that's very dear to me, and I use the term select rather than manifest or rather than attract. And the reason I use the term select is that my hypothesis is that we are selecting events all the time and selecting with them a sense of past, present, and future. Past, present, and future is really just a figure of speech. You know, we know that time is relative. We know that time bends at light speed or in conditions of extreme gravity. We know from the thought experiment called Schrodinger's cat, which I won't go into right now, that the selection of some particle within a quantum lab, the selection of a subatomic particle, necessitates acknowledging that before we selected that particle and thus localized it, it was in an infinitude of positions, which means that there are an infinite number of possible outcomes at play, including outcomes that have to be simultaneously understood. So if this process of selection is a natural law as seen in the particle lab, then a law, in order to be a law, must be consistent. So we could jump to the supposition that this quality of selection is going on all the time. And as with the selection, as with a measurement taken in a particle lab, we are making measurements through our senses, through our perspective, through our preferences, through the stories that we tell ourselves. And when making these selections, we are selecting past, present, and future in ways that we don't even realize. It's happening all the time, constantly, and ever around us. So it does suggest that our perspective, our emotions, our senses, what are these things other than means of measurement? What are the five senses? Taste, touch, smell, and so on. What are they other than means of measurement? Aren't we very possibly making selections all the time and functioning within an infinitude of possible outcomes? And if we so choose, we can make a different selection.
So that begets the question. How do we then use this? What you're talking about is collapsing the wave into the particle with each time that we make notice, that we become aware of something. So how do we then shift our awareness now to shift the outcome?
That is the central question of our lives. It seems to me that what we believe in emotionally rules our lives, that whatever we find emotionally persuasive determines outcome. And if we are telling ourselves a story that we wish to switch to something more positive or something different or what have you, that switch must first be emotionally persuasive. If I tell myself I'm rich, just to take a typical example, and I don't feel that, it's arguable that I'm not making a measurement or a selection at all. I need to be doing so with a sense of emotional persuasion that this is really what's going on, or this is really very possible. So I would suggest, of course, the formula is always live from the end, adopt the feeling state, adopt a state of feeling fulfilled. But if you're in crisis, that may be impossible. Let's be plain. That may be impossible. We are ruled by emotions, and we have to address, we within the New Thought culture in particular, in this generation, here and now, have to address the fact that that central method is not always possible. When people are suffering, when people are in crisis, they are not always able to just rearrange their emotional state, rearrange their psyches. So, is Mother Nature playing a cruel trick on us? Are we told this is the royal key to the kingdom, but the key is inaccessible? Sometimes it can feel that way. What I'm interested in right now, and what I'm working with myself right now, is what can you persuade yourself of? If you're unable to emotionally persuade yourself that you're in conditions of wealth when you're in conditions of poverty, fair enough. I sympathize and I'm right there with you. What can you persuade yourself of? What can you persuade yourself of? Maybe we don't need to make that vast leap from one place to another in order to slide the scale. Maybe we can make a smaller and more persuasive and attainable mental emotional leap. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough. Don't set the bar so high that it's impossible. Maybe it's perfectly fine to set the bar a little lower and allow yourself that freedom, and that may be just enough. That may be just enough. I'm working with this right now, today.
There's a concept in sports psychology. Michael Gervais, he's a very famous sports psychologist. He talks about it. I do it in a lot of visualization work that I do with people. He actually did it with if I get the gentleman's name right, Baumgartner, I believe is his name, the gentleman who jumped out of a hot air balloon at like 118, 120,000 feet. In fact, found himself in a death spiral and managed to pull out of it for the highest parachute or free fall ever. And he helped him visualize it. And what he talks about, and what I do with working with clients, is I want to bring them just before the edge of fear. Have them visualize just as far as the subconscious will allow them to go, and then yank you back. That was successful. Then we go a tiny bit further right before you start to lock down and bring you back. And by visualizing this way, it's not rejected by the subconscious mind. And I believe that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. If something, the subconscious will reject something if it doesn't feel emotionally persuasive. Absolutely, absolutely. And another thing that I think can help the subconscious to accept whatever the new reality is that we want to select is, and this may be something we'll talk about more in another show, is constructing a story that you want to tell yourself about yourself. How, again, let's use prosperity as an example, since that's a hot topic for everybody almost all the time. How would you look? How would you live? How would you be? How would you function in a state of prosperity? These are difficult questions sometimes because we might grow up feeling a certain cultural stance or cultural attitude that could seem to chafe against prosperity. Let's say I love the idea of being like an urban Henry David Thoreau, which is something that I often think about. I love Thoreau. I'm an urban person, but I ask myself, what would my life be like as an urban Thoreau? I don't want that to cut against some greater sense of prosperity. And when I say prosperity, I'm not playing games. I mean cold, hard cash. I mean, let's be plain. This is the 21st century. I can't trade raccoon pelts. I can't, there are things for which you and I and the Inspire Nation listeners need cash. So let's not be Pollyanna-ish about this. Don't let somebody take your need from you by saying, well, what do you mean by prosperity? You're pretty sure you know what you mean by prosperity.
And let's use that prosperity today. Let's attract in all that prosperity so that we can have the biggest lever, because prosperity is abundance, is energy.
Absolutely.
Is chips we can put on the table to make a difference.
Absolutely. No question about that. And I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it. So what story do I tell myself as an urban Thoreau that marries to prosperity so that I can accept, yes, this is really the state I want? Your listeners all have their own needs, their own points of view, their own heroes, growing up. Who are your heroes? And don't be embarrassed by it. You don't have to go running into the next room and tell somebody. I don't know who your heroes are, but you might have somebody who you really dig and you really admire. It's nobody else's business necessarily. And what story do you want to tell yourself around that archetype that allows you to marry your self story to the place that you want to go? That can be very powerful in getting your subconscious to accept this new selection that you wish to make.
Thank you. So going back to Claude Bristol, talk to us, because what we're really talking about here now is living intentionally, bringing awareness. Whether you're bringing awareness, what do I want to look like and feel like when I go out to that protest? Bringing awareness, what do I want to look like and feel like when I'm prosperous, when I'm abundant? You talk about later on, and the idea didn't come from you, about looking like a superhero, about having that superhero in your mind's eye of what you would look like if you're going to be out at least on that public stage. Tell us about mantras and affirmations so that we can be reminding ourselves to stay in this intentional state continuously.
Mantras and affirmations are obviously a key tool of practical metaphysics. And a lot of people have asked the question, going back generations, how can we make these things more persuasive? And there are two ways that I've personally found that will help you make your affirmations or mantras more persuasive. One, which I've talked about on other shows, is to use them just as you're drifting off to sleep at night. This very supple state of mind is called hypnagogia by sleep researchers. Psychical researchers have found that this is prime time for ESP-related activity. Sleep researchers, neuroscientists are studying the state of hypnagogia today because it's a period of in-between. It's a period where you're in between the hallucinatory, dreamlike state of sleep, and yet you still have control over your cognition. So you can select an image, a prayer, a mantra, an affirmation, and your rational defenses at this time, just these few moments before you fall to sleep, and just as you're waking in the morning, your rational defenses are lowered. They're lowered. So it's easier to persuade the mind, the subconscious, of some sort of idealized state. This can work against you too. Some people who suffer from grief or anxiety say that the wee hours of the morning the early hours, are the most difficult time of day. And I believe that's because in this state, this in-between state, again, your rational defenses are lowered. So something that you actually find yourself very capable of dealing with the next day can seem grotesquely huge or intense or enormous, and you're not able to bring perspective to it. That same problem can turn into your greatest ally, because for the same reasons, your mind can also be persuaded of your ideals. And within the state of hypnagogia, this in-between sleep state, your sense of perspective, your sense of rationality, your sense of quantification is lowered. And you're able, but you're still conscious, you're still cognizant. You're able to select an aim that you want to recite internally, a mantra, a prayer. So use that. That's one way that your affirmations can be more persuasive. The second way is the Claude Bristol way, which is just repeat it over and over and over and over. That was the significance of Claude writing down those dollar signs all the time. There was a recovery counselor and a Methodist minister in the mid-20th century named Leslie Weatherhead. He was involved with Alcoholics Anonymous. And Weatherhead asked himself this very question: how can people make their mantras, their affirmations more effective? And he said that the rational mind might be compared to a traffic cop. And the traffic cop prevents anything from coming through that doesn't seem realistic, that doesn't seem grounded in past experience. And this can be very helpful because obviously sometimes we have to sort out what's real from what's not real. But that traffic cop can also be a problem when we want to introduce something novel and new and that radically breaks with the past into our psyches. So he said, look, that traffic cop may be very vigilant, but if you keep trying to get past him over and over and over, eventually you are likely to succeed. So just keep trying. Repeat a mantra, repeat an affirmation, write down those dollar signs on a piece of paper as Claude did. It's not just it's simple, but it's not small. It's simple, but it's not small. The repetition of an affirmation, mantra, or symbol can be very powerful and can eventually lead to the bypassing of the rational apparatus of the mind.
Thank you. And I want to ask you about symbols. We've got time for just a couple more questions here, but maybe three. But one, I want to ask you about symbols. I've got a watch on that has a little tortoise on it. If I start moving really fast, the tortoise turns to a rabbit. I've been looking at just the right tortoise necklace because I believe for myself, staying centered and remembering there's nothing that can't be done half as fast, twice as well. When I slow down internally, and I believe I can actually bend time, a topic for another discussion. We are all bending time by changing our internal clock. But I'm looking at a necklace you're wearing. I can't tell what it means, but I have to believe that anything that you have on you, tattooed to you, or that you're carrying with you has some symbolic meaning behind it as well.
Oh, everything I'm about has. I have several necklaces that I'm wearing here. One of the things I'm wearing is a chai, the Hebrew letter that signifies life, that corresponds to the numeral 18. Now, would you believe, during his last tour, before he died, Elvis Presley wore this chai. This is an exact replica of the chai that Elvis wore. Someone I love very, very deeply got this for me for my birthday last year. I visited Graceland, and I was given this chai as a gift. Elvis discovered that I think it was his maternal grandmother or his maternal great-grandmother had been Jewish. And he discovered this very late in life. So Elvis became very interested in his Jewish roots, and partly in response, he's very into jewelry and body adornment, and he started wearing a chai. You can find pictures online of Elvis 1977, really towards the end, in poor health, but he's wearing this chai on stage. And so this is an exact replica of that. So that was meaningful to me. Another image that I'm wearing here, this is the mezuzah. This is a Jewish, I'm gonna use very loose language here, and I'm gonna say it's a Jewish talisman of good luck, good tidings. It contains a prayer from Leviticus. I was turned on to wear this because of somebody else who's influenced me, and that is Sammy Davis Jr. Mm-hmm. And Sammy experimented with many things, from Judaism to Satanism, and Sammy felt at one point that the mezuzah he had been given was something that was a truly magnificent symbol of life and luck. And he tells a story in in his book, Yes, I Can, really wonderful book. He said, Sammy got in a car accident where he lost his eye. This was a very traumatic thing for him, obviously. And he said that he was driving out of Las Vegas and he realized he left his mezuzah back in his hotel room. And he thought, I should turn around and get it. But it would have cut into his trip and he was already on the road, so he changed his mind. But he said, had I turned around and gotten that mezuzah, I wouldn't have gotten in the car accident. Now, is there a cause and effect? I'm not saying there is. He wasn't saying there is, but it was something that made a significant enough impression on him to write about. Another thing that I have around my neck is the miraculous medal, which is a symbol from Catholicism, which some people may be surprised to see me wearing. But I pay my debts. And I said a prayer to the Virgin Mary at one point for something. I received that something, and I said I'd wear the miraculous medal for the rest of my life. And I'm not a man who goes back on his word, so I did that. And then finally, I have somewhere here, this is all tactile, you realize. This is the snake in the garden, And we'll talk about this on another show, but I feel the snake in the garden was the great emancipator, not a symbol of evil, but the great emancipator and revolutionary who allowed humanity to become itself. So I guess you could say that's a part of the spectrum of my beliefs, and there they are around my neck.
What can you tell me about the jacket?
Oh, that's the second time in 24 hours I've been asked about this jacket.
That just was prompted from the ethos.
Oh, that's funny. I bought this leather jacket, which is from at least the 1940s, at a thrift shop in the neighborhood of Dumbo in Brooklyn. I was purchasing it as a prop, basically, for a television reel that I was shooting. Yep. And I loved it so much that I told the people involved that I wanted to go ahead and purchase it straight out. And one of the things that convinced me that this was the right jacket, apropos of our earlier conversation about the stuff hanging from my neck, is that I found, I can't see it, it's not within the shot, but I found on the pocket of the jacket, somebody many, many years ago, somebody who wore this before me, had put a miraculous medal on the pocket of the jacket, and that served as a sign to me that I was wearing the right thing. So I'm very attached to this jacket, to its previous users, to the miraculous medal that I found on it, and I recently got new lining put in it, so it's not
very, very nice.
It's a little sturdier, a little more weather sturdy.
What is the symbolism behind it? What does it mean when you suit up, when you put on that uniform?
I guess I have always identified with the archetype of the leather jacket wearer. I was watching the Marlon Brando movie, The Wild One, recently. I watched it 3 times in a row. It came out in December of 1953. This was really early. And if you watch that movie, which I encourage, and you look at the styles that are worn in that movie, you see an archetype. The guys in that movie are dressed in such a way that they could be the cover of the Clash album Combat Rock, 2 generations later. They could be anybody, today who's echoing the Clash or whatever. That look became as cemented into the American psyche as the cowboy. And I don't know, call it the rebel, call it whatever you like. I identified with it. And so it's been part of my psyche.
I love it. When I used to ride motorcycles, and now I have promised Jessica for the rest of this lifetime I'll stick with my Tesla or the like. But when I used to ride motorcycles, it was a black leather jacket, not too dissimilar to the one you're wearing right there.
Oh, cool. Bravo. Excellent.
So, couple last questions here. First off, what is the power of here's a loaded question, written word?
Oh, well, I think that writing down an aim is extremely powerful. We were discussing how to enact your affirmations. My feeling is that once you've actually written something down on a piece of paper, not on a tablet, but in a tactile way on a piece of paper, you have actually palpably created something that was not present before. Mm-hmm. There is something there, however nascent, however seemingly small, that was not there before. And you have taken a step into creating something in the world in a physical, tactile way that was not present. I mean, here's a blank piece of paper. Let's say I draw a $sign, for example, on that piece of paper. Well, there's something now created in our world that wasn't there before. Sure, it may seem granular. Sure, it may seem nascent or small, but it's there. It's there. And I believe that's writing down an aim is profoundly important. Any aim is legitimate in my book provided you can take steps toward it, however nascent, however small. So writing down your aim is, I believe, a first step that you're taking in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you. Where can people go to find out more, Mitch, to find your books, to find your work, and to find out what you're sharing with the world today?
My website, as always, is mitchhorowitz.com. Same handle on Twitter. I'm on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. And I have lots of articles posted at Medium that expand on some of what we've been talking about. If you go to Amazon or another online bookseller, you can find, and hopefully there'll be physical booksellers open again soon, you can find The Magic of Believing Action Plan, which is available right now digitally. I have a forthcoming book available in the month of July called The Miracle Habits, which is a very important book to me. And I would ask you to take a look for that if you're interested in my work. The Miracle Habits is a special book for me because it's a follow-up to The Miracle Club. And it's a book that represents a really substantial effort for me. It contains 13 steps that I really truly believe will be transformative in the life of the individual. So those are some things that I have going out into the world right now.
When is Miracle Habits coming out? Because I've got to have you back on for that.
Oh, I'd love it. Miracle Habits is publishing on July 14th, and that will be available in audio, digital, and physical hardback.
Bastille Day.
Oh, is that Bastille Day? How wonderful. Yes. Great. Didn't realize that when my publisher told me the pub date. I don't think he realized it either, although he is French. And so I'll have to tell him that. That's great.
Very, very interesting. So if we were, in a sense, channeling Bristol here today. He survived World War I, Spanish flu, Great Depression. What advice would Claude Bristol give us today for what we're going through now and how to come out the other side, maybe as a collective shining bright?
I believe that Claude would say, look, when I left the Army after the First World War, I witnessed millions of young men who had been in the military streaming back into American life from all over the country. And the economy was rapidly changing, was rapidly moving from an agricultural base to a more industrial or service-oriented base. And a lot of the men of my generation did not know how to adjust to that new economy. And he said he first wrote TNT in 1932, albeit several years later, in order to help people adjust to the new reality. And his feeling was that as you think, so you are, as above, so below, that thoughts are causative. He affirmed everything that the Inspired Nation community believes in. And he would say both individually and en masse, we are capable of generational transformation by using the full spectrum of the power of our thoughts.
Woohoo! Thank you,
you.
Mitch. This has been really fun. This has been,
Likewise.
Who knew? Because this is a day where we're living in a paradox. We're living with
Very
positivity much. And crapidness.
Yes. It's quite remarkable. I mean, here we are. We're right in the midst of various crises. Mm-hmm. Who knows? You know, the world is very unpredictable, but I hope everything we discussed today, I believe everything we discussed today, is deeply serviceable for every Inspire Nation viewer or listener.
I truly believe it is. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the Magic of Believing action plan, and begin changing the world and your life today, and shine bright. Woohoo! That was certainly woohoo worthy, Mitch.
All right. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
If you're watching this, then you are a light worker. You're a light warrior, and I want to help. We offer everything from boot camps, mini masterclasses, full-on masterminds, and private one-on-one coaching with me. To find out more about our upcoming courses, simply visit InspireNationUniversity.com or click on the links below. And to find out more about coaching, simply visit InspireNationUniversity.com/coaching. We also have weekly YouTube live events with me where you can ask me your questions live, and YouTube premieres featuring me and our guests. Simply subscribe below and click on the bell icon to be notified of upcoming shows. I just had the most beautiful Mind as Creator interview with Mitch Horowitz. To check out more Law of Attraction, intentional interviews, change your life and change your world interviews, click here, subscribe below, Click on that bell icon to be notified of upcoming shows, YouTube premieres, and YouTube live events with me. Be sure to join us with our upcoming boot camps by clicking on the link below, and for our mini masterclasses. Big thumbs up if you like this. Leave your comments. Love you guys so much. Shine bright. Woohoo! Love you guys.